The story of organised crime in Ireland today is the story of narcotics.
I think you'll have to view drugs as being the mainstay of organised crime. Most of the upper echelons operate on a very sophisticated basis.
I would describe the modern-day criminal as unpredictable, paranoid, and he will go to any length to protect his business.
The gangsters who jostle for financial gain in the volatile world of drug trafficking are fighting for an empire that was built up in the 1980s through the heroin trade.
When the big profit started seeping through from Europe, they couldn't believe just how much money you could make for very little risk. Some of it, frankly, once you got into the millions, was quite unbelievable.
And then the killing started. There was a man shot at Weaver Street, Fran Rogers. I was there. Gunman walked up to him, shot him in the legs as he tried to run, and then walked up and shot him in the head.
Ireland's €1 billion drug business is controlled by a complex network of criminal gangs.
Organised crime bosses aren't guys with horns and tails who live in rundown estates with their own passwords and language and code of conduct. You know, they're among us.
Their market spreads from the deprived inner cities to small towns, villages and leafy suburbs across the country. Territory is closely guarded with the assassin's bullet. Welcome to Badfellas. In April 2010, Spanish police swooped on what they described as one of the biggest organised crime syndicates in Europe, with tentacles spread throughout the world and an estimated balance sheet of €1 billion from the sale of narcotics.
Money laundering, drug trafficking and gun crime. The business of the international crime network targeted in today's operation.
Operation Shovel involved law enforcement agencies on both sides of the Atlantic. The target was neither the mafia nor a Colombian drug cartel. This huge international conspiracy was an Irish affair.
In all, 17 arrests were made in Spain. 9 of those people are Irish.
At its head was Dubliner Christy Kinahan, aka the Dapper Don. A colourful underworld sophisticate with university degrees and a fluency in at least 3 foreign languages.
It's primarily an Irish organised crime group operating on the continent, but obviously with far-reaching effect. A lot of these more sophisticated drug dealers, drug barons, are removed from actual selling, actual hands-on. They're not even located in this country.
And here was a guy who started off as a small-time drug pusher, ending up with a criminal empire that stretched across 3 or 4 different continents. He's been able to launder his money globally by a series of accountants and financiers, and he's been able to invest into companies like waste renewals and recyclable energies and things like this. So his network was quite vast and complex.
At 53 years of age, Christy Kinahan had come a long way from his days as a heroin addict and a small-time pusher on the streets of the inner city where he grew up. To tell the story of how the lethal business of narcotics contaminated every community in the country, we have to go back to the Dublin of the 1980s.
The Liberties was a great mix of working class and middle class people in that time. My own experience, we had 3 young kids at the time. We lived up in South Earl Street. The thing probably worry most people would be, you know, if they could get a decent job, decent education, maybe meet someone, marry someone, get a decent place. There were a lot of happy memories of life in the Liberties prior to the onslaught of the heroin.
When I grew up in Finglas, there was a great sense of community. You could walk into other people's houses. Doors are left unlocked, believe it or not.
Today, Brian and Teresa Whelan and their 3 children are prisoners of unemployment.
You always felt that no matter what trouble came, there was always a door you could knock on, and there would always be somebody to help you.
From the time that I joined the Garda Síochána in the early 60s and saw the improvement that occurred in relation to housing to an extent, the old tenements were gone, the people were rehoused. A lot of people made progress in life. And then the heroin came.
Yeah. Open it.
The introduction of heroin to the city was a catastrophe for those who lived in the poorer areas.
In the 60s and 70s, drug abuse was virtually unheard of in Ireland. Some students experimented with pot. Some even inhaled. There was a handful of opium addicts attending clinics, but cocaine and heroin were not thought to be substances that the Irish people would acquire a taste for.
In the beginning, the drugs problem was harmless enough in Ireland. The very first Garda drugs investigators were positioned within Special Branch. And that was because drugs were deemed to be something foreign, nothing to do with Ireland or Irish society, and therefore Special Branch, with all their specialties, should deal with them.
Drugs were tacked onto the Special Branch because they dealt with spies and, aliens, so you may as well throw drugs in there. The fact that the Garda band had a superintendent running it, and the press office had a superintendent running it, and the drug squad had a sergeant running it, said an awful lot,
That cosy arrangement wouldn't survive the dramatic mood swing of the 1980s. The 70s witnessed the genesis of organised crime in Ireland. Republican paramilitaries had brought back the gun. Armed robbery was the order of the day, and career criminals had jumped on the bandwagon.
There was a man with a gun coming out of the bank. Two men came out of the bank down with trolleys, and they just put it into the farm.
But by the end of the decade, the cops were giving the robbers a run for their money.
After a Garda chase, about 3 shots were fired at or above these 2 Garda officers. Most, if not all of the money, had been dropped along the way.
By then, armed robbery had become quite a dangerous occupation. I mean, I knew a couple of people in that line of work quite well, and one of them told me that you had 3 minutes from the time you got into a bank to the time you got out again before you could expect the emergency response from the guards. So that was becoming quite a dangerous occupation. If you look at the crime statistics for armed robberies in the late 70s and early 80s, you'll see a dramatic fall-off.
In July 1978, Ireland's leading crime family, the Dunns, pulled off a robbery that would revolutionise organised crime in Ireland. A raid on the antigen factory at Roscrea, County Tipperary, had netted a haul of the painkiller Palfium. Later, when the brothers, led by Larry, realised the black market value of drugs, there was no going back. Narcotics was easy money, and it was big money.
They met a man who I can't name, called him the Prince. He was a very accomplished criminal who cut his teeth in England, had west of Ireland roots, came back to Ireland, very, polished operator. He met the Dunns, and he realised that there was a marriage of convenience possible here. And he basically introduced them to contacts he had in the Middle East, Turks initially, and they began to smuggle heroin and cannabis into Ireland. Dunns very quickly realised this was much safer and more profitable than trying to rob banks.
The heroin problem commenced in the autumn of 1979. It spread out into other gangs and other groups and other families later on, but that, insofar as I am aware, and I was centrally involved in drug investigations through all of that period, that is where it started.
When the Prince met the Dunns, the rules changed. Drugs are suddenly part of the life of Dublin, and they've never gone away since.
The very heart of the city would become ground zero. It was here, on Dublin's most impoverished streets, that Larry Dunn and his brothers would cultivate the market. RTE reporter Brendan O'Brien was one of the first journalists to bring the heroin story to the notice of the Irish public.
Just go up to a flat rate and you can get it straight away like that, and then you just go out and use it.
And do you think there are many people around on it?
It's a lot, yeah.
The Dunns themselves, they were of the people. That was a great strength from their point of view. It was fairly standard practice to, give out drugs free or near to free. And before you know it, they'll be willing to pay for it. And then before you know it, they're addicted. And they're not taking it for pleasure anymore. They're taking it because their system has to have it.
It was like a prairie fire. It just swept through the area. And I think the reason why it happened very quick was because the people knew and in some extent trusted the dealers, because there was a culture there of acceptance of criminality. And once the main criminals turned into drug dealing, there wasn't any question other than this must be okay because they're saying it's okay. And that was the roots of the problem.
For years, Father Paul Lavelle was curate to a large inner-city parish. Then heroin arrived.
If you take New York, I think it's fair to say that proportionately we have as big a problem in certain areas as they would have in any area like Harlem in New York.
Now, these kids were pumping huge amounts of this to make them cope with the pain of life. No job, no school, and they work for a while. They are pleasurable, that's why they take them.
At first, it is probably true to say that people were not aware, including the Duns, of the devastating effect of heroin on ordinary people. But what they quickly came to realize was that it was extremely addictive. And being extremely addictive, people had to continue to buy it. The Duns found that this was highly lucrative and highly successful.
Larry Dunn and his clan nurtured that craving. The Duns hawked their heroin across the city and found they were pushing on open doors.
It did come to my door, yes. My daughter, I think it should be said, she was an addict. It isn't as if it's a sickness, like cancer or something, everyone rallies round. When somebody is feeding a heroin habit, the only thing they have to think about for the rest of the day is where are they going to get fixed up.
The people who love addicts before they become addicts, they're the people who really, really pay the price. Fathers, the mothers, the brothers, the sisters. I mean, when you take it, the son or daughter that you've reared starts coming into their own home, the mother's purse has to be hid, when everything that's valuable in the home has to be locked down, and electrical that can be sold for a quick buck just disappears. You have a family in chaos.
Heroin demoralised families all across the city of Dublin. The police were overwhelmed by the crime wave that the drug unleashed on neighbourhoods.
The police in my area just have washed their hands of the community. They've contained the drug problem within the community and they're happy to keep it there as long as it stays there. I think we all had a sense at that time that the police were just putting in their time, drawing away. They didn't give a shit about working class areas like the one we lived in.
Garda Síochána, I would feel, never thought it was going to reach the epidemic proportion that it did. It happened very quickly, and it happened quietly. At the time, we didn't see it coming.
The basic problem was that a lot of the guards were from the country. They weren't used to an urban situation, the dynamics of a city, and they certainly weren't used to the type of problem that was emerging on the ground, which was the area being flooded by heroin.
Few in Dáil Éireann appreciated the significance of the heroin crisis. The Duns had changed the criminal landscape forever. In time, drug gangs would not only undermine whole communities, but challenge Irish democracy itself.
It's not just Larry Dunn. There are other people just as big as Larry Dunn.
Tony Gregory raised it in the Dáil on a number of occasions. But the political view around Dublin was that while it was a serious issue in the North Inner City, it was confined to the North Inner City. And I actually had discussions with Bertie Ahern because I thought